Hello everyone, this is The Lost Boy. Thanks so much for clicking on this video. Anyone up for a few rounds of Custer's Revenge? Anyone at all? No? Ever since that infamous game, most of us have understood on a deep gut level why something like a video game's rating system is necessary. If you're not aware, Custer's Revenge was a game released in 1982 for the Atari 2600. It featured the famous general scurrying through a hail of arrows in order to rape a Native American woman who's been tied to a pole. Regular non-troglodyte types would likely take a pass on these kinds of games, but more importantly would react with horror at the idea of immature minds being exposed to this level of racism and sexual violence. Quite a few years would pass before anything substantial would be put in place to deal with this emerging problem. Some even point to examples like Custer's Revenge as a component of the overall low quality in video games that led to the North American video game crash of 1983. One interesting thing that followed was a little company called Nintendo, which was one company that was definitely somewhat ahead of its time. Leaders at Nintendo saw and analyzed the factors leading to the video game crash and correctly deduced that two factors were preventing the industry from attaining the stability needed for continued growth. These factors were A, quality, and B, questionability of content. As a reaction to this, Nintendo was very strict with regards to what titles it would allow to be published for its NES console, hence the ubiquitous Nintendo Seal of Quality, which was rigidly enforced using the 10 NES chip to mostly hamstring anyone not licensed who tried to publish games for the NES. Most of what Nintendo improved on at the time was directly related to the aspect of quality, a rise in visual fidelity as well as improvements in game controls and mechanics. However, a more subtle aspect which would especially affect North American users would be the requirements Nintendo had for content it would not allow in its games. The most obvious types of forbidden material include sexual or violent content, as well as content depicting the use or abuse of substances such as drugs and alcohol. However, symbols for religious, nationalistic, or ethnic groups such as crosses, pentagrams, or gods were also not allowed, except for Roman gods. They're okay, obviously. This change was largely responsible for the return of consumer confidence in video games, which allowed the industry to sort of reset itself and begin its journey toward the financial juggernaut the games industry has turned into. For a time, all was well and Nintendo was the king of the castle. But now, here comes the 90s and the birth of the edgelords. Now, in order to sell games, you had to be wackier and loonier and weirder than the others. It was a product of the fact that the teenage/adult video game player was actually just becoming a thing, and with more mature players came more mature appetites for marketing and games. Suddenly, Nintendo's cozy little house of games started to seem cheesy and antiquated. Anyone who cared about the cool factor would likely gravitate more to Sonic than to Mario. You were the least cool person in class if you were sporting the bloodless Mama's Boy version of Mortal Kombat on the NES or Super NES instead of the more hardcore Genesis version in all of its blood-spattered glory. Although the companies themselves were trying to figure out ways to self-regulate, and several other ratings organizations were attempting to assert themselves, things came to a head in 1992 when two Democratic senators led hearings on video game violence and the corruption of society. The hearings established that the current systems in place by various companies and organizations were not consistent or effective, and they threatened to create a federal commission regulating and rating video games. As was the case in past similar instances, such as that of the MPAA, this became quite a highly motivating factor for the games industry as a whole to kind of get its crap together and find a workable way to self-regulate. One large difference between the idea of rating games and films, at least at the time, was that the actual audio and visual fidelity of games had a long ways to go to catch up to even older films. At the time, I'm sure the whole thing seemed silly to many. However, the FMV scenes in the game Night Trap and the photorealistic character models combined with copious blood and fatalities in Mortal Kombat were already of concern and surely indicated where things were headed. In my figuring, this is the key difference between film ratings and game ratings. At the time of the creation of the ESRB, video games were still mainly marketed to and consumed by children and youths. I'm being very kind here, because I suspect a darker motivation is actually at play. However, this argument could be reasonably made, considering where gaming was at in the early 90s. The main difference in the way films and games are rated is that there are actually film ratings which legally prohibit those under a certain age from purchasing, renting, or buying tickets to see them. With games, there is simply no rating that does this. The closest we would have would be the M for mature rating and the AO for adults only rating, neither of which legally precludes access to anyone of any age from what I can tell. This whole set of circumstances has led to a really undesirable outcome in my view. The AO rating is basically a joke. At this time, there are no major retailers whatsoever who carry them, and the main console platforms won't allow AO games to be published on them. Why the hell would they? When I looked up the list of AO rated games on the ESRB website, it listed only 27 titles in total. This is obviously because console platforms and retailers want nothing to do with AO rated titles at all. Instead, what you see is the M rating being the catch-all rating when dealing with games that contain any real amount of mature content. This whole situation might seem a little mysterious if we didn't have the film industry to compare it to, or if you didn't know that money has a pretty amazing way of motivating people. The PG-13 rating was introduced in 1984 by the MPAA, apparently in reaction to violence depicted in the films Gremlins and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Over time, this has had a huge impact on what they're playing down at your local movie theater. For a while, we still got some good R-rated stuff, the Terminators, the RoboCops, the Die Hards, and so on. But slowly, the PG-13 rating started to catch on. Film studios no doubt started asking themselves why they'd forego a big chunk of extra profit by eliminating the under-18 demographic. It was a slow burn, but over time, we have come to a point where even the ridiculously over-budgeted superhero movies where large sections of entire cities are destroyed, you'll find nary a splatter of blood to be seen. No corpses, not a single realistic consequence of the violence being depicted. I'm digressing here a bit, but I do think it's relevant to the topic of games ratings. With films, we've seen a slow migration away from the R rating. With games, we've seen a constant pushing of the envelope of what could be considered acceptable in terms of an M rating. At the same time, all those gamers who were kids in the 80s and 90s are still gamers now, and if we want a gaming experience truly intended for adults, I guess we're just simply out of luck. By contrast, there is a huge glut of M-rated games on the market now that I don't think are at all appropriate for younger kids, and yet the M rating is basically ignored by parents and retailers when allowing younger kids to have what appears to be unfettered access to M-rated games. The end result is a world where children and young people are being overexposed to adult content for the sake of money, and adults are being trained to be content with material that is just toothless and bloodless enough to squeak that M rating through. There is a glimmer of hope in terms of the film side of things. With recent successes, like R-rated films such as Deadpool and Mad Max, Hollywood will no doubt be forced to take notice of the appetite for more mature fare, and maybe the situation can even self-correct somewhat. With games, though, I just don't know. I barely ever hear people even talking about this, so maybe I'm the only one who sees a problem here. I just don't see the problem with at least creating a rating for video games that legally prohibits the game to be purchased or rented by those under a certain age. I'm quite sure hardly any games would use it, especially at first, but I really believe there is a demand for games designed specifically for adult audiences, and that these experiences would really be worth having. Also, that would at least free up game developers to try some really new and innovative storytelling in games. And they wouldn't have to feel constrained by worries of an adult product finding its way into the hands of young people. I feel like this is really just common sense. What do you think? Would you like to see the equivalent of an R rating for video games? Or are things better the way they are now, where people of all ages have access to media that's considered safe for all? Thanks very much for watching this video. Always remember your happy thought, and I'll see you next time.